Sergeant First Class Boyd reached across the table, picked up her range qualification card, looked at it for exactly 2 seconds, and dropped it back down like it was something he'd found on the floor of a gas station bathroom. "Who processed this?" he said to the room. Not to her, to the room. Like she wasn't standing right there. She was standing right there. Her name was Kavanaugh. Staff Sergeant Dana Kavanaugh, 31 years old, 8 years in. 2 deployments to places that didn't make the news, because the people who authorized those deployments preferred it that way. She had driven 4 hours through a February that was doing its best impression of the end of the world to get to CFB Petawawa for the joint integration exercise, and she had been in the building for approximately 11 minutes when Boyd did what Boyd did. The range card said she was qualified to 2,200 meters. Boyd didn't believe it. You could tell he didn't believe it the same way you can tell a lot of things about a person in the first 30 seconds. By what their face does when they think nobody important is watching. "That's a data entry error," he said, finally. "Or whoever signed off on this needs a refresher on what the numbers mean." The 6 other soldiers in the pre-deployment briefing room heard every word. 2 of them laughed. Not loud, not mean, just the quick, involuntary kind that escapes before the brain can run a filter. The other 4 looked at their hands or the wall or the frost building up on the window that faced the flight line. Kavanaugh said nothing. That silence, the particular quality of it, the way it had weight and edges, was something none of them would think about clearly until later. At the time, most of them heard it as acceptance, as a person absorbing a correction and moving on. They were wrong about what they were hearing. The exercise was a Canadian Forces joint integration with a U.S. Army Ranger Battalion rotating through for winter warfare familiarization. 12 days in the Laurentian Shield, temperatures that would sit between -28 and -14 if they were lucky, terrain that rewarded precision and punished assumptions. The Ranger element had brought their own people, their own kit, their own particular institutional confidence that comes from being very good at a very specific thing for a very long time. They had not brought a long-range precision shooter rated for the distances that the exercise scenario required. That was the problem that nobody in the Petawawa briefing room had figured out yet was actually solved. The Ranger Battalion's primary sniper, Staff Sergeant Tillman, had blown out his knee in a training incident 2 weeks prior. His backup, Corporal Reyes, had tested positive for a respiratory infection, bad enough to ground him for medical. The exercise scenario, a simulated hostage recovery in a valley system 40 kilometers north of the base, requiring overwatch at distances exceeding 1,000 meters in conditions that the February Laurentians were going to provide without being asked, needed a shooter. The Canadian Forces liaison, Major Fenchurch, had submitted a request for a qualified replacement 3 days prior. The answer had come back the previous evening, the form of Kavanaugh's transfer orders and the range qualification card that Boyd had just treated like a parking ticket. Fenchurch knew what the card said. Fenchurch had made 3 calls to verify it before he put her name forward, because he understood exactly what Boyd was going to do when she walked through that door, and he had wanted to be absolutely certain before that moment arrived. Boyd had not made any calls. Boyd had looked at the card for 2 seconds and made a decision. "We'll run the evaluation at ZO 800, Boyd said, moving on, folding the moment away like it hadn't happened. "Standard qual distances. If the numbers check out, she's integrated into the Overwatch element. If they don't, she rides support and we resubmit the request." He said this to the room. Still not to her. Kavanaugh looked at the frost on the window. It was doing what frost does, building outward from the edges, slow and systematic, following the path of least resistance toward the center of the glass. She was thinking about wind. She was already thinking about the valley system, about what February does to air pressure over shield granite at altitude, about the kind of cold that doesn't just affect the shooter, but affects the round itself, the barrel, the scope, the math of everything between her and a target she hadn't seen yet. "ZO 800, she said. Boyd looked at her then, just for a moment. Something passed through his expression, not quite acknowledgement, but the precursor to it, the slight recalibration that happens when a person expected one kind of response and received a different kind. He had expected more. He wasn't sure what exactly. A question, maybe. A qualifier. Something that gave him a place to put his doubt. She had not given him a place. "ZO 800, he repeated, and moved to the next item on the briefing sheet. The evaluation range at CFB Petawawa ran east-west along a tree line that offered partial wind shelter for the first 400 meters and nothing after that. By 0745 on a February Tuesday, the temperature was -26 with a wind chill that the duty meteorologist was describing, with what seemed like personal resentment, as -41. The targets were steel plate. The ranges were 600, 800, and 1,000 meters. Nobody had set anything at well 200. There had been a brief conversation about it, and then a shorter silence, and then the range crew had set the 3 distances they'd set. There were 22 people at the range by the time Kavanaugh arrived with her case. This was not a coincidence. Word had moved through a building the way word moves, fast, without asking permission, picking up detail and color as it went. By the time it reached the vehicle mechanics in the South Bay and the signals element quartered in C Block, it had acquired the shape of a story people wanted to see the end of. A woman from somewhere down the 401 with a qualification card. Nobody believed, going up against a ranger evaluation in weather that had already driven 2 junior soldiers back inside, complaining about equipment failures that were probably not equipment failures. Boyd was there. The ranger platoon sergeant, a chief warrant officer named Straker, was there. Straker had been quiet during the briefing. He had the particular stillness of a man who had been in enough rooms with enough people to have learned that the first 30 seconds told you almost nothing useful about anyone, and who had stopped acting on the first 30 seconds a long time ago. He watched Kavanaugh set up without expression. She opened the case. The rifle inside was not standard issue. It was a precision instrument, and several of the more experienced shooters in the group recognized it or recognized what it represented. A system built for someone who needed it to do things that factory specs didn't account for. The kind of hardware that ended up in specific hands for specific reasons. The murmuring started. Straker did not murmur. He watched her settle behind the rifle, adjust the bipod twice, check the wind indicator, and then check it again. Then she appeared to do something internal. A pause. Stillness that was different from the stillness of preparation. Like a person running a calculation that didn't involve anything external. Like a person going somewhere else, briefly, and coming back. Then she went completely quiet, and the 22 people standing behind her went quiet with her, and nobody could have explained exactly why except that something in the quality of her attention had drawn them into it. The shot at 600 meters broke clean. "Hit," said the spotter. "Center." Nobody reacted. That was expected. Anyone worth putting on a range could hit at 600 in good conditions. These weren't good conditions, but still. She didn't move to reload with any hurry. She rechambered with the same economy she'd used for everything else. Then the second shot. Hit. Same. Then the third. The spotter took a moment. When he came back on the radio, something in his voice had shifted by maybe 3 degrees. Not dramatic, just different. 3 rounds, he said, grouped inside 5 centimeters, at 600. Boyd's jaw moved. Not a lot. Just enough that Straker, standing 2 meters to his left, noticed it. She moved to 800 without being asked. The wind had picked up. The flags at the edge of the range were moving in the way February wind moves, irregular, inconsistent, a problem that couldn't be solved by a simple formula because the formula kept changing. She watched the flags for what felt like a long time. Nobody timed it, but later, people would estimate it differently. Some said 30 seconds, some said a full minute. The disagreement wasn't about the clock. It was about how long it felt to stand in -26, watching a woman red wind in absolute silence. She fired 3 rounds at 800 meters. The spotter's voice came back with no gap between target and transmission, like he'd been watching for something specific and wanted to report before the feeling passed. "Same grouping," he said. 8 centimeters, 800 meters, in this wind. Straker uncrossed his arms. It was a small movement. The men standing near him noticed it the way you notice a change in a sound you've been hearing so long you stopped registering it. One of the younger rangers, a specialist 3 months into his first rotation, leaned over to the man beside him and said something quiet. The man beside him shook his head. Not denying, processing. Boyd was very still. She moved to the 1,000-meter position, and this was when something changed in the atmosphere that had nothing to do with the temperature. The quality of the silence changed. What had started as the silence of people waiting to be proven right had become something else entirely. It was the silence of people who had already stopped waiting and were now doing something harder, recalibrating. The 1,000-meter shot, in a -26 February crosswind with irregular gusting was not a shot that most people in that group would have taken with confidence. Reed, the senior Canadian Forces instructor attached to the exercise, had 1,000-meter qualification, but he would tell you honestly that the conditions on that range that morning were at the edge of what he'd attempt, and that he'd have a wide dispersion and he'd own it. She fired once, hit, fired again, hit. The spotter was quiet for a longer moment this time. When he came back, he addressed Straker directly. "Chief, I need you to confirm my read because..." He paused. 3 rounds. One ragged hole, at 1,000 meters, in this wind. The range was completely silent. Boyd turned and walked back toward the tree line. He walked like a man who needed to be somewhere that wasn't here for a few minutes. Nobody followed him. Nobody said anything about where he was going or when he'd be back. Straker walked to the firing bench. He stopped 1.5 meters from where Kavanaugh was still settled behind the rifle, and he looked at the 1,000-meter target through his spotting scope for a long time. Then he lowered the scope. His expression was not the expression of a man who had been proven wrong. It was the expression of a man encountering a fact that he was going to spend some time thinking about. "How long?" he said. She looked up. "Have you been shooting at this distance?" he said. She held his gaze. "Long enough that the distance stopped being the hard part a while ago." Straker nodded once, slowly. The kind of nod that doesn't need anything added to it. The range evaluation did not include a 200-meter target. But someone on the range crew had, quietly and without being asked, set one up at the end of the line during the 800-meter shot. Nobody admitted to doing it, but it was there. Kavanaugh looked at it for a long moment. Then she asked the spotter if he was in position. He was. At 200 meters, in conditions the duty meteorologist had described that morning with personal resentment, she fired twice, 2 rounds, 1 grouping. The spotter didn't say anything for almost 10 seconds. Then he said, to no one in particular and everyone in general, "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this." Straker laughed. It was short and genuine and slightly disbelieving. The kind of laugh that comes out before the brain can make a decision about it. Boyd came back from the tree line 20 minutes later. He had the look of a man who had worked something through and arrived at a conclusion that cost him something but that he was going to stand behind. He found Kavanaugh running post-evaluation maintenance on her rifle at the equipment table. He stood there for a moment. "The qualification card," he said. She didn't look up from the rifle. "It's accurate," he said. She looked up then. Not to confirm it, she knew it was accurate. She looked up because something in his voice told her this was going somewhere, and she wanted to see his face when it got there. "I should have read it," Boyd said, instead of reading into it. It was not a long apology. It was not a comfortable one. But it was honest, and Kavanaugh had been doing this long enough to know the difference between an apology that wants something from you and an apology that's just trying to correct a debt. "Okay," she said. Boyd nodded. "The exercise integration brief is at 1400. You're on the Overwatch element." "I know," she said. He left. She went back to the rifle. The valley system north of Petawawa was a place that rewarded people who had done their homework and punished everyone else without offering any explanation for why it had done so. 40 kilometers of granite and boreal forest and elevation change that the topographic maps told you about in a way that was technically accurate and experientially useless until you were actually in it. The scenario was a simulated hostage recovery at a hardened position in the valley's secondary basin, a structure that could only be approached effectively from a ridge system that sat 1,400 meters from the target building's eastern exposure. Straker had reviewed the approach vectors with Kavanaugh the evening before the insertion, and what struck him, watching her work through the terrain data, was the quality of the questions she asked. Not the tactical questions. Those were good, the kind you'd expect from a qualified shooter, but the ones that came after, the questions about atmospheric conditions specific to the valley system at altitude in February, about how shield granite behaved thermally in extreme cold, about the kind of micro-turbulence that builds over certain terrain features when the temperature differential between ground and air hit a specific range. "You've been thinking about this since you arrived," Straker said. "I've been thinking about it since I read the grid reps in the transfer orders," she said. Straker looked at the map. He looked at the spot she'd already identified as the optimal Overwatch position. Not the one in the original planning document, a different one that accounted for factors the original planner hadn't considered or hadn't had the specific experience to recognize. Why not the position in the brief? He said. She put her finger on the original position. Ground composition. At that elevation, the rock shelf has a particular acoustic signature in cold this extreme. It vibrates at a frequency you can't fully compensate for at 1,400 meters. It's subtle, but subtle is enough to matter at that distance in these conditions. Straker studied the map. Then he studied her. How did you work that out? The wind pattern at the base range this morning had a similar signature, she said. I felt it in the reading, and the terrain data confirms it if you know what you're looking for. Straker looked at the map for a long moment. Then he made a single mark at the position she'd indicated. This is the position, he said. I'll update the planning document. Kavanaugh said nothing. She went back to the terrain data. Boyd found them an hour later, going through the updated approach vectors. He looked at the revised Overwatch position without comment. Then he sat down and picked up the elevation chart and started working through it himself. Nobody asked him to. He just did it, the way a person does, when they've decided to take something seriously and know that serious means starting from scratch, rather than from where they left off. At some point, without anyone declaring it, the three of them were planning the exercise together. Not Boyd directing and the others receiving, planning together. The way people plan when they've accepted that everyone at the table has something the others don't. The insertion was at 0200. The valley in February at 0200 was a particular kind of dark, the kind that has mass, that presses against you, that makes distance feel different from how it measures on paper. The Overwatch element moved to the ridge under cloud cover that kept the temperature ambient and the visibility low, which was both an advantage and a constraint. Kavanaugh reached her position at 0247, 17 minutes after she told Straker she'd need. Her voice came over the encrypted channel flat and steady. Overwatch established. Sight lines confirmed. Ready. In the valley staging area, Straker released a breath he hadn't cataloged as held. Copy, he said. Assault element stand by. What followed was the exercise, the simulated hostage scenario, the timed approach, the coordination between elements working in cold and dark across terrain that didn't make any of it easier. Kavanaugh called 3 simulated threats during the approach window, 2 correctly, 1 partially, and the one she called partial, she flagged as partial in real time, which was the right call, and she explained in the debrief exactly what had limited her read on that target and what she'd need to account for it differently. That last part, the flagging of a partial, the explanation in debrief, was the thing that Straker mentioned later. Not the 400-meter confirmed simulated engagement in -27, the flagging of the partial. Any shooter can make a shot, he said. In the debrief room, with Boyd present and Fenchurch present, and a room full of people who had spent 12 days in a valley that had made its indifference to human pretension extremely clear. The ones you want on your element are the ones who know what they don't know, and say so in real time instead of guessing and hoping. Kavanaugh was at the end of the table. She said nothing. The debrief took 2 hours. When it ended, people filed out in the particular slow way of people who have been cold for a long time and are now warm and would like to stay in that condition for a while. Kavanaugh was gathering her notes when Boyd appeared at the end of the table. He had been working up to something. You could tell by the quality of his stillness in the last 20 minutes of the debrief, the stillness of a man who was waiting for the right moment rather than the next moment, which was a different thing. The card, he said, and then stopped. Started again. What I did when you arrived with the card in front of the room, he paused. That was, I made a determination about what your record meant before I understood what your records said. And that was mine, not the records. Kavanaugh looked at him. He wasn't asking for anything from her. She could see that. He was paying a debt in the only currency he had, which was words said honestly in a room that still had people in it. I appreciate it, she said. He nodded once. Left. Straker was waiting in the hallway. He came to you, Straker said. It wasn't a question. He did. Straker nodded slowly. Boyd is? He's not a bad soldier. He's a lazy thinker sometimes. There's a difference. There is, Kavanaugh said. You know, Straker said, and then seemed to choose his next words with some care. I've been in this business for 17 years. I've met 4 people who shoot the way you shoot. All 4 of them I found out about by watching them do it. None of them were introduced to me in a way that prepared me for it. Kavanaugh looked at him. I don't know why that is, Straker said, but I think it's worth noticing. She was quiet for a moment. It's worth more than noticing. Straker held her gaze. He understood what she meant. He had the specific expression of a man who understood and knew that understanding was not the same as fixing, and was trying to sit with that gap honestly. "What happens after the exercise?" he said. "Where do you go?" "Back to my unit," she said. "There's a range qualification cycle in March. And after that?" She almost smiled. "Not quite. There's always an after that." Straker studied her. "Your record, the actual record, not the card Boyd dropped on the floor. I'd like to read it. Not for any official purpose. Because I think I don't know enough about what you've done and I'd like to." "Most of it's not available for unofficial purposes," she said. "Most of it," he said. "Most of it," she confirmed. He understood. He didn't push. He gave her a nod that meant something different from the nod he'd given her at the range. This one not professional acknowledgement, but something more personal, more chosen. She walked out into the February night. The cold was total, the kind that makes the stars look closer than they are, the kind that clarifies everything down to its actual dimensions. The distance to the tree line, the shape of the ridge she'd sat on for 5 hours the night before, the weight of what she was carrying in the canvas bag over her shoulder. She walked toward the quarters building at the same pace she walked everywhere, which was the pace of a person who knew exactly where she was going and had decided it wasn't worth hurrying. In the building behind her, Straker found Boyd in the common room. Boyd was drinking coffee and looking at the range evaluation report that he'd been sitting with for the better part of an hour. He had not been looking at it continuously. He had been putting it down and picking it up. He had been doing the thing that people do when a document contains information that keeps arriving differently each time they read it. "She's going back to a range qualification cycle in March," Straker said. Boyd looked up. "Whoever allocated her to a range qualification cycle in March," Straker said, "doesn't have full access to her record." Boyd was quiet for a moment. "No, they don't." "That's a problem," Straker said, not angrily. "Just as a fact requiring acknowledgement?" "Yes," Boyd said. "It is." They sat with that for a moment. The common room was warm and the coffee was bad, and through the window the February dark was doing what it always did. Absolute, indifferent, indiscriminate in its cold. "What do we do about it?" Boyd said. Not a question. The opening of a conversation. Straker sat down. He had a specific expression, the expression of a man who has spent 17 years in institutions that were capable of great things and occasionally incapable of basic ones, and who had learned that the difference between those two things was usually the specific decisions of specific people in specific rooms. "We start with a formal request for record review," Straker said. "At my level, with your endorsement." Boyd nodded. "And then we don't stop," Straker said, "because the first request is going to come back partial, and the second is going to come back slower. And at some point, someone is going to tell us that the operational security rationale outweighs the personnel management rationale, and we're going to have to decide how much we believe that." Boyd looked at the range evaluation report one more time. He thought about the 200-meter target that nobody had officially set, but that someone had set anyway. He thought about the spotter's voice coming back over the radio with the particular quality of a person who has seen something that has temporarily removed their available vocabulary. "I believe it less than I did this morning," he said. Straker looked at him. "Good," he said. "Hold on to that." Outside, Kavanaugh reached the quarters building and sat on the edge of the bunk and put her hands in her lap and looked at the wall for a moment. Not thinking about the ridgeline, not yet, just sitting. Letting the cold come out of her body slowly and the weight of the exercise settle into its final shape, the shape that things take when they're finished and you're still there and everything that was temporary has passed. 11 engagements called across 12 days, 11 correct assessments of conditions that were trying their best to be uncorrectable. A valley that had not cared about any of it, that had offered the same granite and the same wind and the same cold to everyone who moved through it regardless of what they'd done before they arrived. She had done her job. She had done it the way she did everything, completely, without qualification, without requesting that anyone observe how completely she'd done it, and she would go back to her unit, and there would be a range qualification cycle in March. And somewhere in a folder with a classification level that most of the people who'd benefited from her work didn't have clearance to access, there was a record of the things she'd done in places that hadn't made the news. She laid back without taking off her jacket. In the common room, Straker and Boyd were still talking. In the debrief room down the hall, someone had left the range evaluation report on the table, and the February wind was pushing against the window above it with the particular persistence of Canadian winter, which does not ask for permission and does not wait for conditions to improve. And somewhere north of the base, in a valley system that was already working on erasing every trace of the people who'd moved through it, the boot prints and the gear impressions and the compressed snow at an overwatched position on a granite ridge that sat 400 meters from a building in a secondary basin. The cold was doing what cold does: systematic, thorough, without opinion. What it could not erase was the record in the evaluation report. What it could not reach was the conversation happening in a building 30 meters from where Kavanaugh slept. And what it could not touch at all was what Straker had said in the hallway to a woman who walked like she already knew where she was going. "You're worth more than noticing." She had heard it. She had carried it back into the cold with her. And she had already moved on to the next problem, the way she always moved on, the way she would always move on. Because the next problem existed and she had what it needed, and she had never once in her career found a way to look at that combination of facts and choose differently.